Hi everybody, Nif here. Welcome to the pilot episode of my own little knockoff of Extra Credits. I really just want to talk about something that's caught my eye recently here, so stick around if you want to hear me ramble on about a subject that I have personally found to be interesting, and that would be Native Americans in video games. So video games are an emerging medium that constantly gets overlooked for what good it can do, and is constantly vilified for all the wrong things that it can do. Narratives in video games can mean just as much, if not more, than their counterparts in traditional media. Video games allow the audience to be engaged by choice and have a potential to tailor each experience to the individual. The potential is too full, unfortunately. Video games can either place the player in another person's shoes and create a real empathy for the situations that those characters find themselves in, or video games can heavily reinforce unhealthy tropes. The difference between the depictions in games and the depictions in non-interactive media is agency. When players choose to do something, they are doing that thing, and they are not watching someone else do that thing. By no means do I mean that traditional media is in any way bad, but rather that video games have another dimension in which to engage the audience. So how are Native Americans portrayed in video games? Well, the first thing that sort of comes to mind is 1982's Custer Revenge for the Atari 2600. It's a unique little game where the objective is to sexually assault a Native American woman tied to a pole, and the harmful, racial depiction is often overshadowed by a larger, more blatant issue of portrayal of women. I'm not saying that racist depictions are more important than sexist depictions, however. I am saying that problems are non-rival, and just because something has something very wrong about it doesn't make any of its other shortcomings any less egregious. But I'm not here to talk about gender in video games. If you want to listen to that argument, you can talk to Anita Sarkeesian. So how does the portrayal of one of Native Americans in Custer's Revenge carry unfortunate implications indicative of our society at large? For one, it propagates the image of sexual colonization in the Native American people. For those of you who are confused at the term sexual colonization, it's a term popularized by academic Andrea Smith that describes the process in which a people is subjugated by sexual domineering. For example, during the first wave of European colonization of America, many explorers considered Native women to be impure and therefore acceptable targets of sexual violence. And that's just unfortunate and depressing. Can you believe they actually made a role-reverse sequel for Custer's Revenge? Moving on. But the other ways that non-player Native characters are often portrayed are as enemies. Games like Call of Juarez Bound in Blood make shooting gameplay out of Native American peoples. The portrayal of natives in the games themselves isn't particularly flattering either, so I'll just use another game as an example. Rockstar's acclaimed Red Dead Redemption. Now, there's a personal story associated with this one. When I was doing research for this topic, I asked my friends about how they felt about the depiction of native people in the game, and they thought about it and they told me, I don't think there were any Native Americans in that game, and there are. The difference between the two cowboy western games I just mentioned is simple. Call of Juarez depicts Native Americans in a way that supports the stereotype. The Plains Indian with feathers in his headband, long hair, with buckskins and beads and tomahawks. That's just what people recognize as being native. However, in Red Dead Redemption, the Indians are depicted wearing denim jeans and cotton vests. They wear 10-gallon hats and play cards in saloons. Even the enemy Native Americans wield guns and are dressed no different from regular bandits. There aren't any tomahawk-throwing, bare-chested Native Americans running around, but there is, however, a clothing option that dresses up the player like a Native American that looks like that in the multiplayer mode, and also all of this is based off of Red Dead Redemption and not the weird Red Dead Revolver spin-off, which deals with more native-y Native Americans. But the fact is that most native-looking character I saw in my research wore no more defining regalia than a turquoise necklace and a red headband. The way that people didn't immediately recognize or remember those characteristics as Native Americans signifies an unfortunate trend in the common consciousness. Native Americans are a thing of the past. People hear Native and they think of old Indians, the one you are likely to see in a Western or a period drama. Very few people think about the contemporary Native or developing Native. People are not static objects. They don't exist in a stasis when not under observation. The problem here is that games like Call of Juarez, people see natives as inherent enemies rather than people. They become a type of thing rather than a human being. There are only one other racial minority, and that has been pigeonholed as enemy so exclusively. And that's them. And that's not a good depiction for either party. Now, then, how about some playable Native American characters? How are they depicted as playable characters? Well, fighting games are the first genre I want to use because they traditionally have been at the forefront of racial representation due to the large amount of characters in each game's roster. Now, they aren't always accurate, and most of the characters depict very stereotypical tropes, while others are just absolutely outlandish. But let's examine two games, one domestic and one foreign. Killer Instinct has a playable Native American character by the name of Chief Thunder, or Hinmatun. He fits nearly every Native American trope to a T. He's this rippling warrior. He fights shirtless, he can summon lightning by rain dancing, and in his power mode, he turns into a flock of ravens. It's not exactly subtle. His story of what little there is revolves around his search and revenge for his missing brother Eagle. Ultimately, it's a gritty character full of silly stereotypes and is very identifiably a noble savage archetype, and this is by the American developer. T-Hawk, on the other hand, from Capcom's Street Fighter is similar. He's big and tall and a physical fighter. He's stoic, wears jeans and a denim vest, and has a hawk, which actually looks suspiciously like a bald eagle as a companion. He wears war paint on his face and a feathered headband. Even the way he lands on people after his signature move is reminiscent of a stereotypical native. T-Hawk's story actually involves him trying to reclaim his tribal land from multinational corporation Shadowloo that massacred his people before he was born. All of that sounds like he'd be a perfect fit for the stereotypical Southwest Indian, but he's actually from Monte Alban, Mexico. If you think that's anywhere near the American Southwest, Monte Alban is here. I want to attribute T-Hawk's archetype to a subversion of traditional Native American tropes, but knowing Capcom and what they've done in the past, it might just have been a misguided, event of racism. After all, this is the company who believes Hakan is the image of Turkish oil wrestling. And honestly, characters in fighting games are pretty lacking in the narrative depth department, but I included them because they were the first adopters of multinational playable characters. So let's take a look at a couple of games that complement each other well. Assassin's Creed 3 and Infamous Second Son. They both follow half-native protagonists through a narrative sort of experience. So Assassin's Creed 3 follows the story of Connor, a half-Mohawk, half-white assassin, taking place in the American Revolution. Despite being half-white, Connor identifies fully with his tribal identity, having been raised by his mother. He has a very close relationship with his mother, and his main motivation involves finding the man that massacred his village and caused the death of his mother. Connor's personality is more introverted and stoic, reminiscent of the traditional native stereotype, but it is in fact part of how the audience observes Connor that causes that. English is actually Connor's second language, so his voice is lacking in inflection and he uses no contractions. It sounds very proper and noble. But once Connor gets more used to the language later on in the story, you find that his internal reflection, that his thoughts are oftentimes idealistic and simple. He has a strong sense of morality and he has an absolute confidence in his own abilities. Many other characters see him as reckless or having bravado, but Connor is just naturally talented. Despite his uniform incorporating slight bits of the traditional native gear set, of which his trusty tomahawk hand axes are the most prominent, Connor looks very much part of Assassin's Creed Assassin. Now, there are several DLC missions that play up Connor's native heritage, using his spirituality as a narrative device to explore alternate history versions of revolutionary America, but in the main game, Connor, despite what many people say, is a complex character that is affected by his native heritage, but not defined by it. His personal experiences are much more important to his development than the color of his skin. Now, in Infamous Second Son, it's kind of similar to Assassin's Creed 3, but it has some very important differences. First, the morality of the character is branching in Infamous, meaning that the player chooses how protagonist Delson Rowe acts. Second, Infamous Second Son is set in modern-day Seattle. Third, his native heritage does not play a very prominent role in his backstory, or his development as a character, until later on. Unlike Connor in the previous example, Delson's name is actually derived in-universe from a Western movie that his mother liked. there's not a lot of native sort of linkage between the present and the past here, unlike Connor. Noting these differences, though, Delson's story is much more dynamic than Connor's own. Skipping the parts in between, it starts and ends with Delson's struggle against authority. In the beginning, he struggles against the local government and his older brother who works as a sheriff, and depending on the player's actions, the game ends with Delson taking down a corrupt government figure. The difference being, in the beginning, he's disconnected from his family. He rebels against all authority, including that of his tribe. But in the end, he fights for his tribe and in the memory of his brother, provided the player made morally just decisions over the course of the game. These two games offer players an empathetic look into the leading roles of two very different Native American narratives. It's hard to put into words, but in games, there is a sense of kinesthetic projection. Players are engaged because when games are done right, the player feels as if they are acting through the character rather than it's just watching events happen on screen. Players can feel the motivations of the characters as their own. They become the target of racial slurs, like when the soldiers in Assassin's Creed called Connor a half-blood. And players can feel the urgency of disgust that Delson harbors against Augustine in Infamous when he discovers that she had poisoned the members of his tribe. Failure becomes a possibility with games. The audience isn't just waiting for the narrative to resolve itself. The players have to work to achieve that end. The player is almost always engaged on a personal level, if not on a narrative level, in whether or not they achieve victory or fail. In that way, games can tell stories much more effectively than other forms of media, which are often tied to a singular ending. Games are experiences, not shows. But games also have another unique aspect to them as a storytelling medium. They can teach lessons through gameplay. A beautiful example of this is Kisima Inachunta, or Never Alone. The game is very novel in its use of Inupiat culture. It teaches as gameplay unfolds, telling stories and factoids about the culture. However, that's not what I mean by storytelling through mechanics. Never Alone has received flack for its imprecise platforming and reliance on two-player co-op. However, there is an argument that has been floating around for a while that I find some credence to. Maybe unintentionally, but the developers have made an experience where it isn't easy to complete as a single person. It would make a lot of sense if you thought about it. Trying to do everything alone in a hunter-gatherer culture like the one that the Inupiat people live in would be very difficult, if not needlessly dangerous, for a single person. The game mechanics, needing that second person, teaches that some things are better done with others. And that's something that's so intrinsic that you can't really get the same sort of message from a movie or a book without it seeming incredibly heavy-handed or narratively driven, because this is a conclusion that you come to after trying and failing at tasks within the game. And games are a great medium for expression of all types, and there are many more examples of Native Americans in video games, and there will be more down the pipeline, I'm sure. This is already running much longer than I originally anticipated, so I'm cutting it off here. I hope you learned something new today. And anyway, I don't know if I'll make another one of these, but in case I do, I'll see you next time.